America is nearly $39 trillion in debt. That number is so large, it almost stops meaning anything. $39 trillion. Countries collapse under far less. Argentina defaulted at a fraction of this. Greece imploded at a fraction of this. Emerging markets spiral when their debt explodes. So why hasn't the United States? Why is the dollar still king? Why does Wall Street still dominate? Why does global finance still run through Washington? If debt destroys nations, why hasn't it destroyed America? Because the debt isn't a flaw in the system, it is the system. And once you understand how it works, you stop asking, when will America collapse? And you start asking a much more uncomfortable question. How long can this advantage last? Here's the first reality most headlines ignore. The world runs on dollars. Nearly 60% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in US dollars. Almost 90% of global currency trades involve the dollar on one side. Oil, priced in dollars. Shipping contracts, settled in dollars. Commodities, dollar-based. Global trade financing, dollar-dominated. That creates something incredibly powerful: permanent global demand. Now think about what that means. If you're Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, Japan, and you need dollars to trade internationally, you need dollar assets. And what is the safest, most liquid dollar asset in the world? US Treasury bonds. So foreign governments, central banks, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, they buy treasuries. As of 2025, foreign investors hold roughly $9 trillion in US debt. Let that sink in. The world funds America. When other countries borrow heavily, investors panic. When America borrows heavily, the world buys more. Because the dollar isn't just a currency, it's the plumbing of global finance. And as long as the world needs dollars, it needs US debt. That's not weakness, that's structural privilege. Now here's where it gets even more counterintuitive. During global crises, investors don't run away from US debt, they run toward it. 2008 financial crisis, money flooded into treasuries. The very country where the crisis began became the global safe haven. 2020 pandemic panic, another surge into US bonds. When banks wobble, when markets crash, when geopolitical tensions rise, money doesn't flee America, it hides there. On average, nearly $900 billion in treasuries trade every single day. No other bond market on Earth comes close. Not Europe, not China, not Japan. The US Treasury market is the deepest, most liquid financial system ever built. And liquidity matters, because liquidity means you can move billions, even trillions, without collapsing prices. That depth gives America something priceless: the ability to borrow enormous sums without triggering panic. Other nations hit a borrowing ceiling. America hits expand. That's why rising US debt doesn't automatically cause capital flight. In many cases, it attracts capital. The bigger the system, the safer it feels, at least for now. Financial dominance doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's reinforced by power. The United States maintains hundreds of military bases worldwide, controls key trade routes, leads NATO, influences the IMF and World Bank, sits at the center of global alliances. That stability underwrites the dollar. Countries like Japan, Germany, and South Korea don't just hold US debt because of returns. They hold it because their security, trade, and financial systems are intertwined with America. The global payment system, from SWIFT messaging to dollar clearing networks, runs through infrastructure influenced or controlled by the US, and that creates leverage. Sanctions, asset freezes, financial restrictions. When the US sanctions a country, it doesn't need tanks. It restricts access to the dollar system. The dollar isn't just money, it's infrastructure, and infrastructure is hard to replace. You don't rebuild the global operating system overnight. which is why even countries that criticize the US often still hold dollars, because participation in the system is more valuable than opposition to it. That geopolitical backbone makes US debt feel less like risk and more like alignment. Now here's the simplest and most misunderstood advantage. America borrows in its own currency. Argentina borrows in dollars. Turkey borrows in euros. Many emerging markets borrow in currencies they cannot control. When their currency weakens, their debt explodes. Imagine earning in pesos but owing in dollars. If the dollar strengthens 30%, your debt effectively rises 30%. That's how default spirals begin. But the United States owes money in dollars, and the United States controls the dollar through the Federal Reserve, through monetary policy, through the ability to issue currency. Now, this does not mean infinite money printing is safe. Print too much and you get inflation. Print recklessly and you erode trust. But structurally, the US cannot run out of dollars the way Argentina can. It cannot be forced into a classic currency mismatch crisis. That changes everything. Default risk looks very different when you control the unit of account. That's the home court advantage, and it's enormous. Now we get to the subtle mechanism. Most US debt is issued at fixed interest rates. That means the government locks in borrowing costs for years, sometimes decades. Now imagine inflation runs at 2 to 3% over time. Gradual, controlled. What happens? Future dollars are worth less. So when the government repays debt 10 years from now, it's repaying in cheaper money. This slowly erodes the real burden of debt, quietly, systematically. Meanwhile, if GDP grows, even modestly, the economy expands while the debt is diluted in real terms. The absolute number gets bigger, but the relative weight can shrink. This isn't accidental. The Federal Reserve targets around 2% long-term inflation for a reason. At that rate, debt doesn't explode uncontrollably, but it also doesn't become heavier in real terms. Time becomes an ally. And in a system this large, time is powerful. So if everything is so stable, why do some economists still worry? Because this advantage is not permanent law, it's confidence, and confidence can erode. If inflation spirals out of control, if political dysfunction undermines fiscal credibility, if another currency system becomes equally liquid and trusted, then the privilege weakens. Not overnight, but gradually. Reserve currency status has shifted before in history. The British pound once ruled global trade. Then it didn't. The key question is not whether America can sustain $39 trillion. It clearly can, for now. The question is, can it sustain the behavior that produced it? Because structural privilege buys flexibility, but it doesn't eliminate math forever. Interest payments are rising, demographics are shifting, entitlement spending is expanding, and at some point, even the deepest bond market must absorb increasing supply. The system works as long as the world believes it works. So why hasn't America collapsed under $39 trillion? Because the world needs dollars. Crises strengthen treasuries. Geopolitical power reinforces trust. America borrows in its own currency, and inflation slowly erodes the burden. The debt isn't a bug in the machine, it's embedded in the architecture. But here's the uncomfortable truth. This advantage isn't infinite, it's rented. Rented from global confidence, rented from institutional stability, rented from the belief that the dollar is safer than the alternative. And the moment that belief shifts, the system changes. Not necessarily with a crash, but with a repricing. So the real question isn't, when will America collapse? It's this: how long can the world afford for it not to?